There is a rock outside the ancient city of Gibeah where a woman refused to sleep for 6 months. She sat on that rock with sackcloth beneath her, guarding the corpses of her sons and her nephews. 7 bodies, left exposed on a hillside, left for the vultures. Every day she chased away the birds. Every night she fought off the wild dogs. She had no army, no servants, no allies, just a mother's grief, a piece of cloth, and the smell of what was left of the men she had raised. Her name was Rizpah, and the story of what she guarded and why those 7 men had to die might be the strangest and most unsettling passage in the entire Old Testament. What nobody realizes, until they sit with this story for a while, is that it involves a 3-year famine, a broken oath from 400 years earlier, a king willing to trade 7 lives to save his kingdom, and an answer from God that, once you understand it, will change how you read the rest of the Bible. I want you to remember 3 things before we start, because they will all come back at the end. 1 rock, 1 mother, and 1 sentence hidden at the very end of the chapter that tells you what actually ended the famine. And it is not what you think. This is the story the Sunday school lessons skip. This is why. Jerusalem, around the year 973 before Christ. King David is at the height of his reign. He has united the 12 tribes. He has moved the Ark of the Covenant into his new capital. He has defeated the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Arameans. He is, by every visible measure, the most successful king Israel has ever had. And his kingdom is starving to death, not for a season, not for a bad harvest. For 3 consecutive years the rain has failed. The winter wheat withers in the field. The barley never comes up. The vineyards on the terraced hills of Judah crack open in the sun. Livestock are butchered before they die of thirst, and then the pastoralists themselves start to die. The Bible describes it in a single devastating sentence. 2 Samuel chapter 21 verse 1. There was a famine in the days of David 3 years, year after year. That phrase, year after year, in Hebrew, Shana Ahar Shana. It hits like a hammer, because in ancient Israel, 1 bad harvest was a crisis, 2 was a catastrophe, 3 was a sign. 3 years of famine meant that something, somewhere, was fundamentally wrong, and David knew it. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because David is not a passive king. He has spent his life talking to God. He has fought his way out of the wilderness by consulting the ephod. He has planned battles by asking the Lord where to strike. He has one habit above all others that defines him as a ruler. When he does not understand something, he asks. The text says David sought the presence of the Lord. That phrase in Hebrew is deeply specific. It does not mean he prayed. It does not mean he offered a sacrifice and hoped for the best. It means he went to the priest, and the priest went into the sanctuary, and they used the sacred instruments of divination that God had given to Israel for exactly this purpose. The Urim and Thummim, the stones that gave answers. Now, most people never heard about this part, but the answer David gets back is not what he was expecting. It is not what any Israelite would have been expecting. It is one of the strangest things God ever says in the Bible. It is because of Saul and because of his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. Read that sentence again, slowly. Saul, the previous king, is dead. He has been dead for years. He was killed in battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. His 3 sons died with him. His grandson Mephibosheth is a crippled invalid living in David's own palace. The house of Saul, politically speaking, no longer exists. And yet God is telling David, through the sacred lot, that this famine is a debt Saul left behind. A debt that has been accruing interest silently for years. A debt that has finally become large enough that it is killing the people of Israel by the thousand. That word, debt, is not decorative, by the way. In the language of Hebrew law, this is exactly what it is. Blood guilt. In Hebrew, damim, literally bloods, plural. Because in the ancient Israelite worldview, innocent blood that had been shed unjustly did not simply vanish. It cried out from the ground, and until it was answered, it defiled the land itself, not metaphorically, legally. And this is the concept most Christians today have completely lost. So stay with me for a second, because if you do not understand blood guilt, the rest of this story is going to feel arbitrary and cruel. If you do understand it, you are going to see why the God of Israel had no choice but to intervene. Read Genesis chapter 4 and you find the same principle. The moment Cain kills Abel, God tells him the ground has opened its mouth to receive his brother's blood, and the ground is now cursed to Cain because of it. Read Numbers chapter 35, and Moses lays out the legal doctrine explicitly. When blood is shed in the land is polluted, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed there except by the blood of the one who shed it. That is not a moral suggestion. That is Israelite constitutional law. And it means that when Saul killed the Gibeonites, whenever that was, and however he did it, he did not just commit a crime. He legally contaminated the country. And now, years after his death, the land is coughing that contamination back up in the form of a famine. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about the story that follows. The Gibeonites. That word will echo through the rest of this video, and most people who read the Bible have no idea who they actually are. They show up briefly in the book of Joshua. They vanish for 4 centuries, and then, in 2 Samuel 21, they come roaring back into the story with a claim on the throne of Israel that will require blood to satisfy. To understand what David is being told in that sanctuary, you have to go back 400 years. You have to go back to the moment when Israel first entered the Promised Land, and to a decision that Joshua made in a moment of weakness that would still be causing casualties in the reign of David. Because the Gibeonites were not Israelites, they were Canaanites. They belonged to a group of cities in the Central Highlands north of Jerusalem that God had specifically commanded Israel to destroy under the laws of Herem, of holy war given in Deuteronomy. No covenant, no treaty, no protection was to be extended to them. They were to be wiped out completely, along with every other Canaanite tribe living in the land. But that is not what happened. Something else happened, something that would haunt Israel for 400 years and lead directly to the death of 7 men on a hill outside Gibeah. Something that would put a mother named Rizpah on a rock, guarding what was left of her family, while a king in Jerusalem tried to understand what he had done. To make sense of the famine, we have to go back to Joshua, and we have to look at one of the most embarrassing episodes in Israel's entire national history. An episode that Israel would rather have forgotten. An episode that God apparently refused to let them forget. Around 1400 before Christ, give or take. The precise date is debated, but the story is not. Joshua has crossed the Jordan River. The walls of Jericho have fallen. The city of Ai has been destroyed. And word has begun to spread through the Canaanite highlands that a new power has arrived, and it is not negotiating. Every king from the Jordan Valley to the Mediterranean coast is watching this, and most of them are choosing the same response. They are forming military coalitions to resist. Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon. They are gathering armies. They are preparing for war. But one city does something else entirely. Gibeon. Now, hold that name in your head, because it is going to come back 400 years later, on the day Rizpah loses her sons. The Hebrew word Gibeon and the Hebrew word Gibeah where Saul was born and where the 7 would eventually be executed, share the same 3-letter root. They mean the hill. They were, geographically speaking, 5 miles apart. 2 neighboring communities tied together by a name that meant the high place, and by a wound that would not heal for 4 generations. Gibeon was not a small village. Archaeology has confirmed it was one of the major population centers of the Central Highlands, larger than Ai, roughly comparable to Jerusalem itself at the time. The book of Joshua says its people were mighty men, warriors. This was a city that could have fought. Instead, its elders chose deception. They came up with a plan that reads, even today, like something out of a spy novel. The elders of Gibeon selected a delegation. They dressed those men in worn-out clothes. They gave them cracked leather wineskins. They loaded old, moldy bread into their bags. They put patched sandals on their feet, and they sent them out on the road toward Israel's camp at Gilgal. When they arrived, they claimed to be ambassadors from a distant land. So far away they had barely heard of the God of Israel and had traveled for months to make peace before the Israelites' rumored conquest ever reached them. They said, "Look at our bread. It was hot when we left. Now it is dry as bone. Look at our wineskins. They were new. Now they are cracked. Look at our sandals, our clothes. The road has consumed them." And Joshua and the elders of Israel, standing there looking at these worn-out men, made a mistake that would echo for the next 400 years. The book of Joshua flags the mistake in a single painful verse. Chapter 9, verse 14. "And the men of Israel took of their victuals, and asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord." They did not ask. Read that line again. Because it is the smallest, quietest sentence in the whole conquest narrative, and it detonates the loudest. David, 4 centuries later, asked. Joshua, in that moment, did not, and it broke the story. Because the elders of Israel accepted the Gibeonites' claim. They sat down, they cut a covenant, they swore an oath by the name of the Lord that they would not destroy Gibeon or its people. They ate bread with them, ratifying the treaty, and they let them go home. 3 days later, the truth came out. The Gibeonites were not from far away. They were the people right next door. They were exactly the people Israel had been commanded to destroy, and they had lied their way into a peace treaty sworn by the name of God himself. The Israelites wanted to attack. The people demanded it, but the elders refused. And they said something that becomes, again, absolutely critical to the story we are telling. They said, "We have sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel. If we break this oath, his wrath will come upon us." So they honored the covenant. They let Gibeon live. And to compensate for the deception, they made the Gibeonites what the Hebrew calls hewers of wood and drawers of water for the community and for the altar of God. Perpetual servants at the sanctuary, not slaves in the modern sense, but a protected class permanently attached to Israel's religious life. Which means, and this is the detail everyone missed at the time, the Gibeonites were not just civilians, they were temple staff. When Saul eventually killed them, he was not just breaking a treaty, he was killing the men who cut the wood for the altar of God. He was killing the men who drew the water for the priests' ritual washings. He was, in a very literal sense, attacking the worship of God with one hand while claiming to defend it with the other. That covenant, that reluctant, awkward, humiliating oath, was still in force 400 years later. It was still binding when Saul was crowned king. It was still binding when he began to reign. It was still binding on the day he decided, for reasons the Bible does not fully explain, that he was going to break it. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the Bible almost never talks about it. There is no chapter in 1 Samuel that describes what Saul did to the Gibeonites. There is no scene where you see the massacre happen. There is no prophet standing over him afterward. There is no account of it in any of the parallel material in Chronicles. If you were reading through the Old Testament for the first time, you would arrive at 2 Samuel 21 and find yourself asking, "Wait, what? When did that happen?" And the fact that it is missing is itself a clue. Ancient royal chronicles are usually careful to record atrocities the king committed against enemies because those functioned as propaganda. Kings bragged about massacres. Assyrian kings had them carved on palace walls. If Saul's massacre of the Gibeonites is not recorded, one of two things is true. Either the scribes suppressed it, or Saul himself did. Either way, someone in the royal court knew this was not a story you wanted told. The only fragment of information we get comes in 2 Samuel 21 verse 2, almost in passing. Saul, we are told, sought to slay the Gibeonites in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. In his zeal, that is the phrase, in Hebrew, bakanato. His jealousy, his fanatical loyalty to his own people, meaning whatever Saul did to the Gibeonites, he did it thinking he was doing something patriotic, thinking he was doing God a favor by cleaning up the mistake Joshua had made 400 years earlier. He was going to be more Israelite than Joshua. He was going to fix the ancient failure. He was going to complete the herem, the sacred cleansing of the land that Joshua had left undone. And in doing so, he committed one of the worst crimes in Israelite legal history. Because you cannot break an oath sworn by the name of the Lord and call it obedience. That is not zeal, that is sacrilege, and it does not matter that the original oath was obtained by fraud. Once the name of God has been invoked, the oath is binding on the party who swore it. The elders of Israel had said this in Joshua 9 itself. If we break this oath, wrath will come upon us. Now, if you are wondering how a king could have missed that, you are asking exactly the right question. And this is where the historical background of Saul's reign becomes essential. Saul was Israel's first king. He had no royal precedent. He had no palace legal advisors trained in generations of covenant law. He was essentially a farmer from Benjamin who had been thrown into the deep end of ancient statecraft with no training and mounting paranoia. 1 Samuel is one long portrait of a man who progressively loses the ability to think straight. He disobeys Samuel. He tries to kill David. He murders 85 priests at Nob because he thinks they helped David escape. This is not a stable ruler. This is a man whose relationship with God has been visibly deteriorating for years. The massacre of the Gibeonites fits that pattern. It is the act of a king who has convinced himself that his personal will is God's will, and it is exactly the kind of act that ancient scribes would later quietly delete from the official record. Now imagine you are David, standing in the sanctuary in Jerusalem, hearing all of this delivered back to you through the Urim and Thummim. Imagine you are trying to make sense of it. Somewhere in the reign of the previous king, decades ago, that king had gone into the Gibeonite settlements. Archaeological evidence suggests these were located in a cluster of villages, including Gibeon itself, Kephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim, all within a short walk of Saul's own home base at Gibeah of Benjamin. That geography, by the way, is a detail scholars have wrestled with for centuries, because Saul's own capital and the Gibeonite cities were essentially neighbors. And that raises a very ugly possibility, that Saul's motive was not just religious purity, that he wanted the land, that his tribe wanted the land, that the massacre was less about theology and more about real estate, that he decided the ancient covenant was inconvenient for the kingdom he was building, and he chose to solve the problem the way Bronze Age kings tended to solve problems, with soldiers. There is one other clue nobody talks about. In the book of Joshua, chapter 18, When the Promised Land is being divided among the 12 tribes, Gibeon and the surrounding Gibeonite cities are all assigned to the tribe of Benjamin, Saul's tribe, which means the men Saul massacred were, in the eyes of tribal geography, sitting on Benjaminite territory, not as owners, as protected residents. And Saul, the king from Benjamin, may have decided the arrangement had gone on long enough. We do not know exactly how many Gibeonites Saul killed. The text implies it was significant enough that the survivors were later willing to demand 7 royal lives in exchange. Whatever the number was, it was large enough to leave a stain on the land that lasted for years. Nobody in Israel talked about it. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody remembered it. Nobody, that is, except the God of Israel and the Gibeonites themselves. And now, in the 3rd year of drought, the silence had ended. The blood was calling, and David was the king who had inherited the debt. He had to find a way to pay it, and what he did next is going to be, depending on how you read it, either the most humble act of a righteous king or the most calculated political move in his entire reign. Possibly both. You decide. So David does something that no king in the ancient world would normally do. He goes to the victims. Understand how strange this is. In Bronze Age monarchies, when a king had a political problem involving a subject population, the king dictated the terms. He did not consult. He did not negotiate. He did not ask a group of protected foreign servants what they thought would be a fair remedy. He decided, and they complied. David does not do that. He calls the surviving Gibeonite leaders to Jerusalem. He sits them down, and he asks them a question that changes everything. 2 Samuel 21, verse 3. What shall I do for you, and with what shall I make atonement, that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? Read the components of that sentence carefully. He is asking them what needs to happen. He is using the word atonement, in Hebrew kafar, the same word used for the Great Day of Atonement, and he is asking them to bless the inheritance of the Lord, which is another way of saying, lift the curse from our land. David is not offering restitution. He is offering ritual reconciliation. He is asking the wronged party to name the price at which the covenant can be repaired. Now, before we get to what the Gibeonites answered, I want you to notice something the pastors almost never point out. David is doing here on a national scale what Jesus will later tell his followers to do on a personal scale in Matthew chapter 5. If you are bringing your gift to the altar and you remember that your brother has something against you, leave the gift at the altar, go, be reconciled with your brother, and then come back and offer your gift. Reconciliation before ritual. Repair before worship. David is not just fixing a legal problem. He is enacting a theology that will echo forward for 1,000 years. Keep that in your head. It matters for the ending. The Gibeonites answer with 2 statements, and their answers are almost as unsettling as the demand that follows. First, they say, this is not about money. We will have no silver nor gold of Saul, nor of his house. That refusal is important. It tells you what kind of injury they believe was done. Financial compensation would have implied that Gibeonite lives were commodities that could be priced out. They are rejecting that framework. What was taken from them was blood, and in the moral logic of the ancient Near East, blood can only be answered with blood. Second, they say, this is also not about revenge on anyone else. Neither for us shalt thou kill any man in Israel. That is also important. They are not asking for a war. They are not asking to be given permission to rampage through the countryside, settling old scores with random Benjaminites. They are asking for something extremely specific, and then they name it. Let 7 men of his sons be delivered unto us, and we will hang them up unto the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord did choose. 7 descendants of Saul hanged in Saul's own hometown, in the presence of God. I want you to sit with the weight of that demand for a moment, because everything about it is deliberate. 7, in Hebrew thinking, is the number of covenant completion. It is the number of the days of creation. It is the number of the Sabbath cycle. It is the number that appears at every solemn moment of oath swearing in the ancient world, from Abraham's 7 ewe lambs at Beersheba to the sevenfold cursing of covenant treaties. The Hebrew verb for swearing an oath, shava, literally shares its root with the number 7, sheva. To swear was, etymologically, to seven yourself. The Gibeonites are not asking for random deaths. They are asking in the deepest possible symbolic register for the covenant to be reset. Blood sworn back into the ground where blood had been broken. The descendants of Saul, specifically, not because those specific individuals are personally guilty of the massacre, but because in the ancient concept of the royal house, the king's family carries the king's debts. When Saul acted, he acted in his capacity as king, which means his royal line inherits the moral obligation of what he did. This is not a modern legal concept, but it is the ancient one, and it is baked into the covenant structure of the entire Old Testament. Modern readers hate this. It offends our sense of individual justice, and it should offend us on one level. But we cannot understand this story if we refuse to understand the moral universe it operates in. In the ancient Near East, the king was not just a person. The king was a corporate representative of the nation. When Achan sinned in the book of Joshua, all of Israel suffered for it. When David sinned in taking the census, 70,000 Israelites died in the plague that followed. This is the world 2 Samuel 21 is written inside of. Individual innocence does not cancel corporate guilt. Corporate guilt has to be corporately resolved. And they will hang them in Gibeah of Saul, his own hometown, his own royal seat, in front of everyone, not hidden, not private, a public act in the place where the crime originated, in the presence of the God whose name Saul had broken. David listens to this, and 2 Samuel 21 verse 6 records his response with 3 of the most quiet and terrible words in the Hebrew Bible. I will give them. He agrees, on the spot, without protest, without asking to consult, without asking for time. Some readers, over the centuries, have been horrified by this. How could a righteous king do this? How could David, the man after God's own heart, agree to hand over 7 men to be executed for a crime they did not personally commit? But watch what David does next, because it reveals that his agreement was not simply obedience, it was calculation. David selects the 7. Under the terms he has just agreed to, in theory, any male descendant of Saul is eligible. Saul had multiple wives, multiple concubines, multiple children and grandchildren. The extended royal family, though diminished, still contained many people. David could have chosen anyone. But he does not choose them randomly. He does not draw lots. He does not open the matter to the Gibeonites for their own selection. He, personally, decides which 7. And here is where the political dimension of this story crashes into the theological one. David chooses 2 sons of a woman named Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. Rizpah was one of Saul's concubines. Her 2 sons were Armoni and Mephibosheth, not the famous crippled Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. A different one. This is one of the reasons the story is confusing to modern readers. There are 2 men named Mephibosheth in 2 Samuel. One is the beloved friend's son, the other is the concubine's son. The similarity in names was probably one reason later editors of the Bible sometimes changed the name of the concubine's son to Merib-Baal to reduce confusion. Then David chooses 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul. Merab was Saul's older daughter. She had originally been promised to David as a wife back when David was killing giants and Saul was still on the throne. That marriage never happened. Saul, in one of his fits of paranoid political maneuvering, married Merab off instead to a man named Adriel, the son of Barzillai the Meholathite. Merab and Adriel had 5 sons. That is the 7. 2 grandchildren by concubine, 5 grandchildren by royal daughter. Now, if you are a student of ancient monarchies, you are already noticing something, and this is the detail everyone missed at the time. David spares Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan. Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, was also a direct male descendant of Saul. In fact, he was the highest-ranking one still alive. He was the crown prince, in a sense, of the extinct royal house. If the Gibeonites' demand had been strictly about descendancy, he was the most obvious target. But David spares him, and the text is explicit about why. 2 Samuel 21, verse 7. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. David keeps one oath. David breaks no oath he personally swore, but the branch of the royal house that David is politically closest to, the branch descended from his beloved friend Jonathan, gets to live. The branches descended from a concubine and from a daughter David never got to marry do not. If you want to be uncharitable, you can read this as David seizing a legitimate crisis in order to eliminate rival claimants to his own throne. Rizpah, historically, is not a minor character in the political struggles after Saul's death. 2 Samuel chapter 3 describes an ugly dispute between Saul's general Abner and Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth, and the flashpoint of that dispute was Rizpah. Abner had apparently taken her, which under ancient Near Eastern law was a claim on the throne itself. Rizpah's sons were, quietly, potential rivals to David's line. You do not have to accept that David was cynical. You can believe he was doing what he thought was necessary. But you have to notice that the men he sent to die belonged to the branches of the family that could have caused him political trouble, and the men he spared belonged to the branch that could not. That is not a coincidence. And this is the part where things stopped being simple, because from this moment forward, the story is no longer about the sin of Saul. It is about the choices of David, and every reader from the 4th century onward has had to decide for themselves whether the king who wrote the Psalms was capable of this kind of calculation, and what it says about him if he was. Whatever David's motives were, the decision was made. 7 names were spoken, 7 men were arrested, and the elders of Gibeon began preparing the hill outside the city, sharpening the wooden stakes on which the 7 would be impaled, waiting for the day when the covenant would finally be paid. Now, quick pause before we walk up that hill. If this deep dive is the kind of Bible content you actually wanted to find on YouTube and you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Every single week on this channel we open one of these passages, the ones nobody preaches on, the ones that make theologians nervous, the ones with women in them who were never given a voice. Next Sunday we open the strangest execution in the book of Judges, the one where a woman drives a tent peg through a general's skull and is called blessed above all women for it. You do not want to miss that. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, come back next week. All right, back to Gibeah of Saul in the 2nd year of the reign at the beginning of the barley harvest, because what is about to happen on that hill is going to change everything. By the calendar of ancient Israel, the beginning of the barley harvest fell somewhere in what we would call late April or early May. It was the beginning of the agricultural year. It was also the season during which the Passover was celebrated. And it was, in the years of the drought, exactly the season when the failure of the rains would be most visible. The hills would already be turning brown. The wheat that should have been standing green would be stunted or absent altogether. every eye in Israel would have been on the fields and on the sky and on Jerusalem, waiting. That is when the 7 men were brought to Gibeah. The Hebrew text is spare and unflinching. It says the Gibeonites took the 7, and they hanged them on the hill before the Lord, and they fell all 7 together. 2 Samuel 21, verse 9. The word translated hanged here is not the word for hanging with a rope. In Hebrew, it is yaka, a rare and gruesome verb. Some translators render it impaled or exposed on stakes. The scholarly consensus is that the 7 men were most likely killed first. Then their bodies were fixed to wooden posts and displayed publicly on the hillside, which was, in the ancient Near East, the standard way of communicating that this was not just a punishment, it was a message. And the message was not primarily for other Israelites, it was for God. The phrase "before the Lord," Lifnei YWH, is critical. This execution was a religious act, not just a legal one. It was a sacrifice of covenant restoration. It was staged in front of the God whose name Saul had violated, in the place where Saul had lived, at the exact moment of the agricultural year when the drought would be most acutely felt. And then something happened that nobody expected. The bodies were left there. Now, this is a huge deal in Israelite law, and most modern readers miss it completely, because Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23, contains one of the most explicit instructions in the entire Torah on this subject. If a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is hanged on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God. That your land be not defiled. Read that final line again. That your land be not defiled. There is a bitter, terrible irony in what is happening on that hill. The whole reason the 7 are dying is that the land has been defiled by innocent blood, and now, immediately after their deaths, the bodies are being left in violation of a law whose stated purpose is to prevent the land from being defiled. Why? The text does not explicitly say, but the most likely explanation is that this exposure was itself part of the Gibeonite demand. In the ancient world, leaving an executed body exposed was a way of saying that the crime being punished was so serious that even the normal customs of burial were suspended. It was a public spectacle of shame directed at the house of Saul, and the Gibeonites, whose people had been massacred without a proper burial themselves, may have insisted on it as part of the atonement package. Whatever the reason, when the sun set on that first day, the bodies of the 7 were still on the stakes. Armoni was still there. The concubine's Mephibosheth was still there. The 5 sons of Merab were still there. Nobody moved them. Nobody covered them. Nobody said a prayer. Nobody except one woman. The Hebrew is heartbreaking. 2 Samuel 21, verse 10. And Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for her upon the rock, from the beginning of harvest until water dropped upon them out of heaven, and suffered neither the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. Look at what that verse is telling you. Rizpah goes up onto the hill. She takes a piece of sackcloth, the coarse, dark fabric of mourning, the fabric of grief. She spreads it, not over the bodies because that would violate the terms of the Gibeonite atonement, but over a rock nearby. She makes herself a station, a tent, a vigil post, and she stays. She stays from the beginning of harvest, which, as we said, was likely April or May, until water dropped from heaven. The text does not specify whether water from heaven here means the first autumn rains, which in Israel typically begin in late October, or something else. If it is the autumn rains, then Rizpah kept vigil for approximately 6 months. 6 months of days and nights on that hillside, 6 months of chasing away vultures with sticks, 6 months of screaming at jackals in the dark, 6 months of the smell. I want you to slow down here. Because most sermons that touch this story hurry past this section like it is background detail. It is not background detail. It is the theological center of the entire chapter. And the horror of it is what makes the ending mean anything. Imagine the first week. Imagine the sun coming up on the second morning and Rizpah waking on that rock and the smell already changing and understanding dimly that she is going to have to do this every day until something in Jerusalem breaks. Imagine the second week. The vultures have learned her rhythm. They circle further out during the day and drop in at dusk when they think she is tired. She keeps a fire. She keeps a stick. She keeps her voice. Imagine the summer heat. Israel in July on an exposed hillside is oven hot. The bodies are no longer bodies in the way she remembers her sons. They are something else now. And still she stays. Imagine the nights. In the highlands of Benjamin, in the 1st century before the Common Era, the nocturnal predators would have included jackals, wild dogs, hyenas, and probably the occasional lion. All of them would have smelled the hill from miles. All of them would have come. Understand what that smell would have been. Understand what that vigil would have done to her. Understand that we are not told anything about food or water or shelter. The Bible offers no explanation of how she survived. It just tells you that she did, and that she did not leave. And here is what she is really doing. She cannot give her sons a burial. That option has been taken from her. What she can do is refuse the second death. In the ancient Israelite imagination, being consumed by wild animals after death was more than a physical horror. It was the ultimate desecration. It meant that even in the grave, the person could not rest, because there was no grave. Rizpah is denying that final degradation to her sons and her nephews. She is guarding what is left of their humanity, and she is doing it alone. She has no political power. She is a former concubine of a dead king. Her sons are dead. She has no husband, no protector, no clan army. She has nothing, and yet she is the moral center of the entire book of 2 Samuel. Now, this is where the story gets bigger than Rizpah, and you need to pay attention, because the image of a mother keeping watch over the bodies of her murdered sons is not unique to this chapter. It is a pattern the Hebrew Bible returns to again and again whenever it wants to say something the male speakers of power will not say. Hagar sitting alone in the wilderness of Beersheba, refusing to watch her son die. The unnamed mother in 1 Kings 3, who would rather give up her child than let him be cut in half. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are not in Jeremiah 31, a verse the Gospel of Matthew will later apply to the massacre of the innocents in Bethlehem. Rizpah on the rock is a fixture of this pattern. She is the mother who will not let the powerful pretend the dead do not matter. She is the woman who forces the political machine to look at what it has done. And when Christian readers, thousands of years later, watch Mary standing at the foot of the cross, refusing to look away from what Rome and the Sanhedrin have done to her son, they are watching the same pattern. The mother who guards, the mother who does not consent to the erasure. Rizpah is the ancient prototype, and the writer of Samuel knew it, because for those 6 months, every Israelite who passed by that hill saw her there. Every messenger going between the coastal cities and the highlands saw her there. Every trader on the road from Jerusalem to the north country saw her there. Every priest, every soldier, every farmer, every child. Rizpah on the rock, Rizpah with the sackcloth, Rizpah beating away the crows in the noon sun, Rizpah lighting a fire to keep the jackals off at midnight. You have to understand what this would have done to the collective conscience of Israel. This was not a private grief. This was a public indictment. Every day the vigil continued was another day that the kingdom of David could not pretend the 7 had simply disappeared. The Gibeonite atonement had a fixed price of blood. Rizpah, by refusing to leave, was quietly demanding that the atonement also have a price of mercy, and every passing week made that demand louder. Word of what she was doing began to spread, and it spread all the way to Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 21, verse 11. And it was told David what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. Notice the phrasing. Not what happened to the sons of Saul, not the situation on the hill outside Gibeah. What Rizpah had done, she has become the story. Her act has eclipsed the execution itself. The men who ordered the deaths of the 7 are no longer the ones being talked about. She is. And when David hears about it, something breaks in him. The next verse, verse 12, opens with the words, "So David went." Not David sent messengers. Not David gave the order. David got up. David went personally. And what he does next is the moment the story turns. David does not just retrieve the bodies of the 7. He does something much larger. He rides north to a small town on the far side of the Jordan River called Jabesh Gilead. And he goes there because Jabesh Gilead is the place where, decades earlier, a small band of loyalists had done for Saul what Rizpah is doing now for Saul's descendants. The story of Jabesh Gilead is a footnote in most Bibles, but it is essential to what David is about to do. When Saul and his 3 sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, were killed on Mount Gilboa, the Philistines had fixed their bodies to the wall of the city of Beth-shan as war trophies. And the men of Jabesh Gilead, remembering that Saul had once saved their city in the earliest days of his reign, marched through the night, took the bodies down, brought them home, burned them, buried the bones, and fasted 7 days. Notice the parallel that the writer of Samuel is building, 2 acts of defiance against the exposure of royal corpses decades apart. One by the men of Jabesh Gilead, one by a concubine on a rock. 2 moments where somebody without political power refused to accept that the dead should be left unguarded. And in both cases, the throne of Israel eventually was shamed into responding. Rizpah's vigil had reminded David of Jabesh Gilead. It had reminded him that there was still unfinished business in the house of Saul. It had reminded him that the founder of the dynasty he had replaced still did not have a proper family tomb. So David takes the bones of Saul and Jonathan from Jabesh Gilead. He collects the bones of the 7, which by this point in the vigil are what remain on the hill outside Gibeah. He carries all of them, all 9 sets of remains, south into the territory of Benjamin, and he buries them in a place called Zelah, in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father. Everything Saul lost, David gathers. Everything Saul left broken, David tries to make whole. He gives Saul's family, in death, the dignity Saul's family had been denied in life. And Rizpah, for the first time in 6 months, comes down from the rock. The text does not say what happens to her after that. She does what almost every non-royal woman in the Old Testament does. She disappears from the record, but her sons are in a tomb. They have a name, they have a place, and the second death has been refused. And then 2 Samuel 21, verse 14, ends with the sentence that has puzzled interpreters for 2,000 years. And after that, God was entreated for the land. The famine ended. That is the resolution. That is the promised answer to the mystery that opened the story. That is the point at which the drought that had been killing the kingdom of Israel for 3 years finally lifted, and the rain came, and the harvest returned, and the crisis passed. But here is the question that any careful reader has to ask. What actually ended the famine? If you read the passage on the surface, you would say it was the execution of the 7. That was the ritual atonement demanded by the Gibeonites. That was the blood-for-blood settlement. That was the covenantal act. Kill the 7, and the drought is over. That is the reading you would give if you skimmed the chapter, but that is not what the text says. Read verse 14 again. And after that. Not after the execution, after the burial, after the collection of the bones, after the vigil of Rizpah had shamed the king of Israel into treating the dead with mercy. God was entreated for the land after David did the thing that Rizpah had made him see he needed to do. The famine did not end when the 7 were killed. The famine ended when the 7 were buried. That is the theological weight of this chapter, and this is the mystery no one ever explains from the pulpit. It is not the death of the 7 that satisfied the covenant. It is the honoring of the dead that satisfied it. Because what Saul had done to the Gibeonites was not just kill them. He had denied them the covenant protection they had been legally guaranteed. He had treated them as if their lives did not matter, as if their oath did not matter, as if their humanity could be waived because they were foreigners and it was politically convenient. He had committed the sin of contempt, and no amount of blood spilled on a hillside can atone for the sin of contempt. Contempt is answered by the recovery of dignity, by the retrieval of names, by the giving of a tomb. Rizpah understood this before David did. Rizpah understood it before the priests did. Rizpah, sitting on a rock in the sun with a piece of sackcloth, understood it because she was the mother of 2 of the 7. She could see what the theologians and kings and generals could not see, that the story could not end with more contempt. It had to end with dignity restored, even to the dead, even to the guilty, even to the descendants of a king who had done a monstrous thing. That is why this passage sits in the Bible. That is why it was preserved when so many other stories were quietly forgotten. And that is why, 400 years after the reign of David, when the exiled Jewish community was compiling and preserving its sacred writings during the Babylonian captivity, they refused to cut this chapter, even though it made David look bad, even though it did not fit neatly into the narrative of David as the ideal king, even though it named a concubine and a mother as the moral hinge of the entire 2nd book of Samuel, because they knew what Rizpah had done, and they knew what it meant. There is one more thing this chapter does that most readers miss, and it is the thing that ties Rizpah to every mother who has ever refused to be quiet. She never speaks. In the entire chapter, Rizpah does not have a single line of recorded dialogue, not one word. She acts, she stays, she refuses, but she does not argue her case. She does not petition the king. She does not send messengers with grievances. She does not curse the Gibeonites or wail against David. She just sits on the rock for 6 months. And that silence is loud, because in the ancient world, and in almost every world since, women in the position of Rizpah, concubines of dead kings, mothers of executed sons, women without clan, without money, without political rank, were the least audible voices in the entire social hierarchy. Nobody wrote down what they said. Nobody preserved what they thought. Nobody carved their grievances into monuments. The writer of Samuel understood this, and he did something extraordinary. He built the entire climax of the 2nd book of Samuel around a woman who does not speak, around a woman who acts without justifying herself, around a woman whose vigil alone was more eloquent than any argument the elders of Gibeon or the priests of Jerusalem could have made. This is a pattern the Hebrew Bible commits to over and over if you are looking for it. Hannah prays silently, and Eli thinks she is drunk. The Shunammite woman in 2 Kings 4 refuses to explain her grief to Elisha's servant and demands the prophet himself. Esther risks her life without ever telling the reader what she is feeling. Ruth follows Naomi across the border with a single sentence and then works in silence in the fields of Boaz. The Bible has a category, quiet but consistent, of women whose actions do the theological heavy lifting while the men around them talk. Rizpah is one of the loudest examples of it. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every time you read a story where a woman acts without explaining herself, you should be asking, what is the writer telling me that this culture would not let her say out loud? There is also a strange, quiet echo of Rizpah in the prophets. The book of Isaiah, chapter 62, opens with a metaphor about watchmen who never keep silent day or night, standing on the walls of Jerusalem until God restores the city. Watchmen who refuse to rest. Watchmen who will not let God forget what has been promised. Nobody is arguing that Isaiah was directly quoting the Rizpah story, but the imagery is the same. A guardian who does not sleep. A refusal to accept silence. A vigil that shames the powerful into action. Rizpah invented that. Or if she did not invent it, she was the first person the Hebrew Bible names as doing it, and the writers of the later prophetic books remembered her, even when they did not name her. You want to know how you read the Old Testament correctly? Watch who bends, watch who breaks. Watch which characters seem small in the political story, but turn out to be enormous in the theological one. Rizpah is one of those characters. She has no royal title. She has no prophetic office. She has no army, no wealth, no historical claim. She is a mother with a rock and a cloth and 6 months of vigilance and enough love to embarrass a king into remembering his humanity. And this is the detail everyone missed at the time. The story of the 7 sons of Saul is not really a story about 7 sons of Saul. It is a story about one woman on a rock. It is a story about what happens when someone refuses to accept that the covenant obligation ends at the point of death. It is a story about the terrible cost of blood guilt and about the even more terrible cost of pretending that blood guilt does not exist. It is a story about a king who was politically sophisticated enough to know how to end a famine and morally slow enough to need a mother's example to know how to end it well. And it is a story about a God who, apparently, will not be satisfied by executions alone, who insists on burial, who insists on dignity, who insists on names being remembered. The rain came in the end. The famine ended. The land was healed, but it was not healed on the hill outside Gibeah. It was healed in the tomb of Kish in Zelah, when the last bone of the last son was laid in the ground beside the bones of the grandfather he had never known. And somewhere, in a story the Bible does not tell, Rizpah walked back to her village. She had lost her sons. She had won the war for their dignity. And the God of Israel, the record suggests, had watched every minute of it, and had waited for her to finish, before he let the rain fall. 6 months on a rock, 2 sons, 5 nephews, 1 mother refusing to let contempt have the last word. Rizpah does not have a book in the Bible. She does not have a chapter. She has 15 verses in 2 Samuel 21. And in those 15 verses, she quietly rewrites the ending of the reign of Saul, redefines what atonement looks like, and shames the greatest king Israel ever had into remembering that even the guilty deserve a grave. If this is the kind of passage that grabs you, the kind of story your Sunday school forgot to mention, subscribe. Every week on this channel, we walk into the corners of the Bible that most people skip, the uncomfortable ones, the ones that reward patience, the ones with women on rocks and kings who need to be reminded that the covenant runs deeper than the executioner's stake. Next Sunday, we open the strangest execution in the book of Judges, the one that ends with a woman driving a tent peg through a general's skull, and why the Bible calls that act blessed above all women in the tent. Until then, remember the rock outside Gibeah. Remember what one mother did there, and ask yourself how much of the Bible you have been reading without seeing the women who were carrying it.